From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
A judge rules Donald Trump's first criminal trial will begin on April 15th in New York, while an appeals court in that state drops the bond amount due in his civil fraud case by almost 70%. We'll discuss both legal developments with former federal prosecutor Michael Zeldin.
The UN Security Council adopts a resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. The U.S. abstention from that vote, failing to pacify Israel, which canceled its delegation's visit to D.C. this week. Former National Security Council official Hagar Chemali will give us her reaction.
And turnover in the top ranks of Boeing. CEO David Calhoun will step down at year-end, part of the company's leadership overhaul sparked by a safety crisis. So clearly a busy Monday in the news world in terms of business news and political news as well, Joe. And a lot of that centered around former President Donald Trump, who had his multi-front legal battle on full display up north in New York today.
Well, that's true. And of course, the big takeaway here is we do have a date for the first criminal trial of a former president. That will be April 15th, tax day. This is Alvin Bragg's trial in New York, the hush money case involving Stormy Daniels that will move forward. It had been delayed, Kaylee, for a couple of weeks here because of an evidence dump. The other big development, of course, had to do with the bond that the former president is due in a separate case.
Yeah, he was due to either pay $454 million or a bond, 120% that amount today. But the appeals court slicing that down to $175 million. He now has 10 days to get that done. He says he'll use cash as collateral.
Yeah, so I guess a mixed day when it comes to Donald Trump's legal future. We did hear from him following his court date in New York. He spoke with reporters afterward. Here he is.
We have a man who just ruled he'd like the trial to start in 21 days or something. And I don't know how you can have a trial that's going on right in the middle of an election. Not fair. Not fair. It's not fair at all.
Joining us now with more from New York is Bloomberg legal reporter Eric Larson. So, Eric, April 15th is now the date, whether or not Trump likes it. It appears he certainly does not. Does he have any recourse now to delay this even further? He talked about the prospect of appeal when he emerged from the courtroom today.
He did, but I think the prospects are a little slim for that at this point. You know, as you said, this trial was supposed to start already, and so it was actually supposed to start today. So it's been delayed over this last-minute evidence issue. There was a full hearing on all of these arguments today, and frankly, the judge really grilled Trump's lawyers in court about how late they were in requesting this evidence to begin with and sort of rejected this whole argument. So the judge seems adamant about starting this trial on time this time around, April 15th. Of course, Trump has every right to try to do a last-minute appeal from court here. But for right now, we're planning on this trial beginning.
An appeals court managed to slash by more than 2/3, Eric, as we mentioned, the bond that the former president is due to post in the New York civil trial. This is a separate case here. It came down to $175 million. Based on what Donald Trump had mentioned, that still could be too much money, though. Right now, he says he could post bond.
Yeah, you know, he has said all along in this case as he's been trying to get this bond reduced. He had previously told the appeals court to either waive the bond altogether or allow him to post a smaller one of $100 million, which he said was the most he was really able to secure with these insurance companies that arrange these bonds. But as you said, Trump said today, once this $175 million bond was arranged, that he would pay it. So he did say on Friday, he went on Truth Social and said that he has $500 million in cash. Theoretically, if that's true, he'll be able to use cash to secure this bond. So he has 10 days to do that. And is based on his comments today, it seems like he will.
Eric, thank you for the update. I know it was a busy day for you. It's great to have you reporting to kick us off here. Eric Larson with us from New York. Elsewhere, the UN Security Council approving a resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire in Gaza during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, marking the first time the council has agreed to do so in the near 6 months since the Israel-Hamas war began. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby discussed the U.S. decision to abstain from that vote.
Today, as you all know, we abstained on a UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza till the end of Ramadan and the release of all the hostages. Our vote does not, I repeat, does not represent a shift in our policy. We've been very clear, we've been very consistent in our support for a ceasefire as part of a hostage deal.
For more, let's bring in Bloomberg White House correspondent Michelle Jamrisko. Michelle, it's good to see you. Obviously, Israel wanted a veto here, not an abstention.
Yeah, that's right. It's it's kind of a tricky thing to kind of explain. You saw John Kirby there at the briefing today, Admiral Kirby, talking about why it was an abstention and not a veto. They did agree. The U.S. did agree with the calling out of, calling for a ceasefire. That's what they, as he said, been consistent with the policy. However, Israel did not like the fact, and the U.S. did not like the fact that there was not a mention of the Hamas attack and Hamas's role in this. So it was a very fine line. Israel, of course, forcing the issue, wanting a full veto and a full-throated support there, and then the U.S. kind of caught in the middle here where they're constantly having to say, yes, this is our ally. We defend their right and responsibility to defend themselves. However, some of these humanitarian concerns are growing in nature, and that's where the friction between the two allies is coming in.
Yeah, well, and you certainly saw that on full display when Vice President Kamala Harris gave an interview over the weekend in which she said she's ruling nothing out in terms of consequences Israel could face from the U.S. if it were to move ahead with a military operation in Rafah. And it kind of begs the question as to whether or not the Israeli government will heed anything that the U.S. administration says, even if we are seeing a tone shift, or even if Admiral Kirby says it's not totally a shift in position, seeing it on the edges, does it ultimately even matter?
Yeah, no, that's right. And the vice president has been among the more outspoken on this issue in terms of kind of taking it a little bit further and not threatening, of course, a key ally, but saying there will be consequences and really kind of expressing what, she and others believe is at the heart of the issue for a lot of Democrats and other voters who are maybe in agreement with Biden more generally, but in disagreement with how he's handling this. They're really pushing the humanitarian concerns, and that whole ground operation in Rafah is at the heart of this. This is what caused Israel to kind of cancel the delegation they would have sent to Washington to discuss those plans. Progressive
Democrats are upset. 22 of them voted against the funding bill last week because there was money for Israel, almost $4 billion in there. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the floor of the House on Friday called this an ongoing genocide. How does the White House feel about that?
Well, I mean, they can't agree with that language, and they don't. And I think there's constantly this sort of, complicated explanation that they have to give. Again, going back to this is an ally. They need to kind of pursue this fight against Hamas, but their enemy is not the Palestinian people. And that explanation hasn't been acceptable to a lot of, the progressives in their party.
Which speaks to one of the great difficulties this president faces as he campaigns for re-election, trying to make sure the more progressive wing of his coalition stays with him, despite his stance toward being supportive of Israel. But on the subject of his re-election campaign, he's continuing his swing state swing. He's going to be in North Carolina tomorrow. What message is he really going to be trying to bring home there?
Well, I think what you're seeing, I mean, this is, of course, we're in the middle of two wars, but the campaign season goes on. And when he goes to places like North Carolina, these sort of kitchen table territory places, he's making the case on issues like price gouging, corporate price gouging, as he would say, taxes, and basically pushing, he loves to use the phrase, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. So he's saying this is what Trump and MAGA Republicans are doing. This is what they're proposing that will drive up your prices, that will, give tax giveaways to the rich. And then he's saying, our alternative is this vision of Bidenomics, of, bringing down these prices, continuing to bring down inflation. And, he's having a hard time getting that message to hit home with voters who are just still dissatisfied with mainly the cost of living, but other issues that are related to that.
All right. Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisko, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, coming up, we will continue the conversation regarding Israel, Hamas, and Israel's relationship with the U.S. Former National Security Council official Hagar Chemali will be with us coming up next on Bloomberg Balance of Power on TV and radio.
We are happy that the Council has successfully adopted the much-needed resolution to demand the immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the release of hostages.
That was Pedro Comissário Afonso, Mozambique's permanent representative to the United Nations, after the Security Council voted in favor of a resolution for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. The U.S. abstained from the vote, but Israel wanted a veto, and it canceled its delegation's trip to the U.S. this week as a result. Founder and CEO of Greenwich Media Strategies and former director for Syria and Lebanon at the National Security Council, Hagar Chemali, is joining us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio for more on these developments. Hagar, always great to see you. It begs the question, given the response Israel had to the UN security vote today, this resolution clearly that they are upset about, yet what does the resolution actually change for Israel?
Well, this resolution, as with many UN resolutions that aren't under what's called Chapter 7, is non-binding. That means that it is a show of a message or unity of the UN Security Council. It is a statement. It's something that is meant to show the views of the international community, if you will, and certainly the strongest powers at the UN. But it's not enforceable by any means. It's called non-binding. But still, that doesn't mean that it wasn't a strong message. Clearly was, since Israel, as you mentioned, they canceled their trip to Washington, D.C. It was a significant move for the U.S. to abstain from this resolution. There is, while the U.S. has abstained before on resolutions related to Israel, it is not common. It's not that there isn't precedent for it, but the last time it happened was 2016, when the UN Security Council declared settlements to be illegal, and the U.S. abstained from that resolution. But since then, there hasn't been another one, so it's a very big deal.
Was Benjamin Netanyahu, Hagar, just looking for an excuse to cancel this delegation?
Things had been growing more and more tense as time had been growing. And in fact, the rumors over the weekend were already, so before the resolution, were that he was considering canceling, or that he was telling his advisors that, and his aides who were traveling, that maybe not to pursue it. And to be fair, the fact that the U.S. abstained on the resolution was also not expected. It was a surprise to most of us. I myself expected the U.S. to veto, as it had for the last several rounds. This is the fifth resolution that has come to the UN Security Council. The fourth one was on Friday. That was a U.S. draft that Russia and China vetoed. This resolution, what made it different is that it does not condemn Hamas, which was in the U.S. drafted one. And while it calls for the release of hostages, it doesn't tie the release of hostages directly as a condition for a ceasefire, which is something that the U.S. insists on as well. All that to be said is that things had been growing tense because of the increasing calls by the United States for Israel not to go into Rafah. And that is a key point here, because while John Kirby has said, and your White House correspondent reiterated this, that this is not a shift in policy, it's not a shift in policy. But that said, the policy has evolved. And I don't believe the U.S. would have abstained from this resolution had it not been for their strong call on Israel not to go into Rafah.
Well, we certainly heard that call this weekend, Hagar, from Vice President Kamala Harris. She was on ABC's This Week yesterday and was asked about the relationship with Israel and what happens if they do go into Rafah. Just take a listen to what she said.
Netanyahu appears to just be flat out ignoring President Biden's warning about an offensive in Rafah. Is that a red line for your administration?
We have been clear in multiple conversations and in every way that any major military operation in Rafah would be a huge mistake.
And she went on to say, Hagar, that she wasn't ruling anything out in terms of consequences for Israel if they were to push forward with what she characterized as a mistake. What would those consequences look like?
Right. It's a little bit of tough love here, because what the vice president was trying to really show here is that as a friend to Israel, the U.S. is telling Israel not to do this because it is because of the friendship we have, because we care about Israel's security. And also, by the way, because there is significant, it could backlash in the United States as well. You could see increased anger, increased terrorist threats against the United States. And so what to answer your question, though, about what could happen, you have already a discussion happening on Capitol Hill about making aid to Israel, military aid appropriations, conditional, and without a doubt that would grow, and that is outside of the control of the White House. Really, now the White House is at the end would be the one to sign any kind of bill, but if the majority of Congress decides that they have to make this aid conditional, because they have such serious concerns about how Israel approaches this war, then that's the most significant. But that I wouldn't go beyond that. I don't expect, for example, the relationship to completely falter or to fall, or Israel to no longer be an ally. But that's how I would view it mostly, is this question of whether the aid becomes conditional.
Spending time with Hagar Chemali here on Balance of Power, I need to ask you about this horrifying terror attack in Russia and the blame game that we're now witnessing here, Hagar, with reporting that the U.S. did provide a warning to Russia. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre was asked about this in the briefing room. Here's what she said.
In early March, the United States, this government shared information with Russia about a planned terror attack in Moscow. We were very clear about that. On March 7th, we actually informed Americans in Russia did a public advisory, to be more specific. And, ISIS bears the sole responsibility here. The sole responsibility, and Mr. Putin understands that. We shared that with their government, and so there is no evidence, absolutely no evidence, that Ukraine was involved here.
Well, Vladimir Putin, Hagar, is blaming Islamist militants, but also continuing to tie this somehow to Ukraine. How does the administration handle this?
Right. A lot of this is about being ahead of the information war, because what Putin is doing is extremely dangerous by tying this to Ukraine, because not only is he using this attack, which, by the way, the idea that is Ukraine is absurd. Anybody who studies how these attacks are pursued, by the way, whether it's the Ukrainian attacks that have happened inside Russia's borders and ISIS attacks, this has all the markings of an ISIS attack. And we saw a very recent one take place in Iran only a couple of months ago. It's very similar. This is the same group that pursued that massive attack in Afghanistan when the Taliban took over and the government fell. So anyway, all this to say that what Putin is doing is very dangerous. He's using this attack, obviously, to garner, to increase Russian anger toward Ukraine among the public and to garner support for his war. And that's dangerous because then he could use this attack to justify some kind of horrific attack in Ukraine. And now you have the U.S. is basically, that's why the U.S. is trying to win this information war and come out ahead. And they did come out ahead. And by the way, I can tell you, having been in government a long time, the duty to warn is something the United States government takes very seriously. And it's one of the things I like to say just highlights how good the United States government is, where it doesn't matter if it's an adversary. If they see something where innocents are going to be harmed, they go to that government and they warn them and say, here's this intelligence we have. We feel a responsibility to share this with you. Now, please take action against it. And from the beginning of that March 7th statement, Putin went out against it and said that the U.S. and the West were working to instigate problems, and ultimately that stems from an insecurity. Now, all of it is very dangerous, but ultimately to answer your question on how the U.S. handles it, they have to keep beating this drum publicly to win this war, this information war, and work with the Russians behind the scenes and just say, no, you're not going to pursue something against, the truth, so stop with your propaganda.
Hagar, it's great to share your experience with us, as always. Hagar Chemali, we thank you for being with us on Balance of Power. Coming up on Bloomberg, a corporate shakeup at the top of Boeing, and then some. We'll dig into the details next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines in Washington. Big day for Boeing, where CEO Dave Calhoun is stepping down at the end of the year, part of a sweeping leadership overhaul as the company struggles to get a handle on a spiraling safety crisis. He spoke earlier today on CNBC.
Why now? I've entered my 5th year. At the end of this year, I'll be close to 68 years old. I've always said to the board, and the board has been very prepared, I would give them plenty of notice so that they could understand and plan succession in regular order. And that's what this is about. It's me giving them notice that at the end of this year, I plan to retire.
There you have it, complete with the music. Joining us now, Bloomberg Intelligence senior analyst George Ferguson. George, I know you've been talking about this all day, and we have nothing but questions. There was a meeting last week with Boeing's customers, the airlines, and the board that did not invite the CEO, Dave Calhoun. Did the airlines express their desire to have him step down in that meeting?
I think so, right? So I think prior to that meeting, there was a lot of discussion about whether he was safe in his job or not. And a lot of the chatter in the industry was that, Dave Calhoun is pretty well connected to many people on the board. And so something happened to change the board's mind dramatically, it appears to us. And so I think it was the airline CEO showing up and saying, there's a lot of concern about flying Boeing product. You're on a real slippery slope with your reputation, and you've got to do something to shore it up quickly. And I think this was the change. This and the head of commercial airplane division.
George, are we counting this as quickly if he's not stepping down for another 8+ months? He's just a lame duck for a while here now. What gets done in the interim?
Agreed. So I think it's bad, really bad. And I think, again, another sign that the board was unprepared to move on from the current CEO. They weren't thinking about it. I would hope that they've just given themselves a lot of space so they can go out and conduct an effective search. And if they find the right person, they would bring them in early. There's a lot going on this year with Boeing, right? They're talking about buying one of the major sub-manufacturers for the 737. Yeah. Spirit Aerosystems. They need to do that well. That's going to help set the table for the new CEO. They're going to negotiate with their unions starting in September. That's going to set the table for the new CEO. They got to talk to the FAA about how they're going to stabilize their production process. That's going to set the table for the new CEO. I think if you're the new CEO, you'd want to be there to have those discussions rather than have the lame duck do it. And so I think that they've probably given themselves a lot of room, and potentially it could happen earlier.
All right, well, I guess we'll find out whether that person is internal or maybe it has to be an external candidate just for the credibility of the company. George Ferguson of Bloomberg Intelligence, thank you so much for joining us. He thinks external. Well, coming up, we're going to turn to legal challenges around Donald Trump. We'll be joined by former federal prosecutor Michael Zeldin next on Bloomberg.
Greatly respect the decision of the appellate division, and we will abide by that. We'll put up cash or bond very quickly, securities, cash or bond, whatever it is. We'll put it up very quickly, and we'll win the case.
Former President Trump talking with reporters earlier today following news that his criminal trial in New York, the Alvin Bragg hush money trial, would begin on April 15th. Joining us now, former federal prosecutor Michael Zeldin. Michael, we have a couple of news developments to talk to you about involving Donald Trump's legal situation. We'll get to the bail matter or the bond matter in the civil trial in a moment. I just wondered if we could tap your view right now, your experience on the significance of this moment. It gets bogged down in a lot of details and a lot of noise here involving multiple trials and many counts. The fact of the matter is the first criminal trial of a former president is now about to begin.
That's exactly right. The headline should be a former president of the United States is going to stand trial for business fraud. That's a serious headline. And, it's a serious case factually. The way he paid Stormy Daniels and then lied about it on his books by repaying Michael Cohen, saying it was legal fees. There's no real defense to it factually. There is, however, a defense to it legally, whether or not the statutes that are used to charge him are appropriate in this case. And so there's going to be a big legal fight. But if they ever get down to just the facts of the case, I think he's got a hard time winning it.
Yeah, it's worth keeping in mind that he's charged with 34 felony counts here of falsifying business records, and what typically may be a misdemeanor has been escalated to a felony because Alvin Bragg argues it was done to subvert federal election law. So that's essentially what we're dealing with here. The question is whether or not we firmly, for sure, will be dealing with this beginning April 15th. Obviously, that is when the judge ruled today that jury selection will begin. But Donald Trump was talking about wanting to appeal. Do you see any real way in which this could get delayed even further, keeping in mind this was all supposed to start today of all days?
Yeah, I don't think there's another basis for delay. The judge has ruled on the pretrial motions. They determined that it wasn't selective prosecution and that there wasn't prosecutorial misconduct and that the case has been docketed and ready to go for a while. And so there is no appeal to take to delay this, and the judge is hell-bent on starting this thing. So, I mean, barring lightning striking, I think we're going to be picking a jury on April 15.
There you have it, as we wait to see if Donald Trump can pay this new lower bond in the civil case against him in New York, what was more than $450 million. Michael's now $175 million. This appeals court brought it down by more than 2/3. Was that the right thing to do?
I think so. I don't like the whole bail system, whether it's on the criminal justice side, where poor people are held pending trial because they can't make money bail, or in this case, where you have a $400+ million verdict, and he's asking to put up $175 million, plus they could take liens on property if they need to. I think this was the right decision. I don't like people losing their rights in the system, criminal or civil, because of money. I just think it's a bad look. So I'm happy for this outcome. What's interesting about this decision, too, besides the $175 million, is that all of the other parts of the order, save for the monitor, are also stayed. That is, the Trump kids can be part of business dealings in New York. Weisselberg can be part of business dealings in New York. They can get loans. So it's really sort of a slap at the trial judge's determination about what is an appropriate penalty in this case. And I don't know if that's a portend of how the Court of Appeals will deal with this on the merits, but I don't think it was a great day for the trial judge.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Michael, because my question was essentially that it may not be a great day for the trial judge or for Letitia James, for that matter, who argued that he should be posting this full amount because of concern that he ultimately would not, because this appeals process still has to play out. Does this change anything in your mind about the likelihood of the outcome of that appeal maybe being different than we would have thought before today?
Well, it's a great question, and I don't know for sure that this is not an indication that the Court of Appeals feels that the penalty may be too harsh. It may be that the Court of Appeals says, look, on the facts of the case, they've proved their case and he is held liable. But on the penalty phase of it, it's just, like Eighth Amendment stuff. It's like cruel and unusual and beyond what the crime calls for, and they lower the penalty. But either way, even if the court were to lower the penalty, an appellate court lower the penalty to $175 million, that's a significant penalty. And it's a finding that this man and his company engaged in systemic fraud. And there's no good news about that judgment.
If you're glad or find it to be appropriate, I should say, Michael, that this bond was cut significantly, do you also think it would be inappropriate for Letitia James to begin seizing properties if he cannot pay this dollar figure?
Properties are really tricky. I don't believe that Trump owns any of these properties outright. It's not like seizing our car or even our family home if we own it without a mortgage at this point. Yeah. He's got a lot of business partners and probably REITs and other mechanisms by which these are held. So it's not a very easy process that has a lot of implications for a lot of others of his partners. So if she were to start proceedings, I would start with cash and all of his liquid assets. And I think I'd leave the property until the last stage of any sort of judgment collection after a court of appeals ruled finally that he has to pay that amount of money. I just don't like divesting people of their interests in fire sale ways before there's a very final judgment from a court of appeals saying the end is here.
I'm just looking at my calendar here, Michael, trying to do some math. He has now 10 days to obviously make this bond. That would get us to Thursday, April 4th. Then 11 days after that is April 15th, when the criminal trial would begin. And then just 10 days after the criminal trial starting is argument day for the Supreme Court. They'll be hearing arguments related to his immunity case, the issue of whether or not he is immune from prosecution as a former president in Jack Smith's 2020 election interference. How far from that argument date do you expect we'll actually get a ruling from the court for that matter? Because that would allow Jack Smith potentially to move forward with his trial once the New York trial wraps up. I realize I just said a lot there, but basically, when do we get a SCOTUS ruling?
Well, it's a great question, too. You got great questions today. In Bush versus Gore, there was a decision in 3 days. In United States versus Nixon, it was in a matter of weeks. And so the court has the capacity to rule in a 3-day, multiple week period. If they slow walk it and they wait till the end of the term, that'll be the end of June. The judges said if this is, a case that can now go forward because they found no immunity, parties will have 30 days to prepare. So let's say you take an end of June decision, 30-day window to prepare. You could have a trial in early August, and this trial could last, August, September, October, and be done. So even if the court slow walks it, I think there's still time to try this case before the November election. And actually, of course, it's not the November election that even matters. They could try this case after the November election, whether he wins or loses. It's really January 6th that is the determination day of, whether he becomes president or not.
What a thing to consider. We could have a president-elect who then may be indicted on felonies in between the actual election and his inauguration. Michael Zeldin, former federal prosecutor, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. We appreciate your legal expertise. Now, coming up, we'll get some political expertise in the room. We're joined by our political panel to continue our conversation around Trump's legal woes. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Now that the bond's been reduced, are you going to start putting money into your campaign? You haven't done that since 2016.
Well, first of all, it's none of your business, frankly. But I might do that. I have the option. But if I have to spend $500 million on a bond, I wouldn't have that option. I'd have to start selling things. I don't have to sell anything.
That was former President Donald Trump earlier taking questions from reporters after two developments on his many legal challenges developed. One being that he only has to pay a $175 million bond in New York's civil fraud case, while in the criminal case in New York, he's going to trial April 15th, or at least so ruled the judge today. We'll see if he has any success in delaying that further. For more, let's bring in our political panel for this discussion. Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. So, Rick, in that question and answer session with reporters, he also was asked whether or not he would testify in this upcoming trial, which would be just weeks away. And he said, sure. As a lawyer, you may think one thing. If you're Trump's campaign manager, what do you think about him taking the stand in his own defense in a criminal trial mid-campaign?
No, I would want to do everything I could to stop him from doing that. Look, we've all seen enough of his depositions to realize how unhinged this thing can become, right? And a good prosecutor is going to get under his skin. It's not hard to figure out what kind of buttons to push. And so I think that would be a disaster from a political perspective. Now, I'm sure Donald Trump believes I can handle anything. This is my platform. I'm doing incredibly well by attending these trials. And why not put me on the stand? It'll be like having a debate. And nobody can debate like I can. And that's probably what the campaign manager's worried about.
Wow. Jeannie, we heard a lot from Donald Trump today. It took us longer to fact check his remarks than it did to hear them. Referring to election interference in this case, he talked about Biden and his thugs, even though this is not a federal case here. The weaponization of the DOJ, he referred to lawfare. Talked about the border, talked about Israel, talked about the number of people who have crossed the border. He said, no one's reported that, but I bet I'm right. When we're dealing with the abstract like this, how does the Biden campaign handle that? Do you call them out one by one? Do you wait for this speech at the end of the day? How do you do it?
You know, I think they keep calling him out. We heard them come out today already, and they're going to keep doing that. But, you know, this is a very bad day for Donald Trump with this trial set. It is a very bad day for America. But politically, it is a good day for the Biden campaign, because this election is going to be won for Joe Biden if the focus is on Donald Trump. And it'll be won for Trump if the focus is on Joe Biden. So anything that keeps the focus on Trump is a good day for the Biden campaign. They're going to allow him to go out there, say all kinds of things like he said today, and give the fact checkers an enormous task, as you guys had, trying to, you know, figure out and unravel the truth from the fiction that he tells. But the reality is, this is the presidential nominee and former president going in front of a New York court on a criminal case. And he comes out and he says a bunch of nonsense. But one thing he said was true. This is a case about election interference, but not by the Biden DOJ, by Trump in 2016. And so he's going to go on trial for that.
Well, when we think about what we're hearing from the former president, Rick, and we've heard these things repeatedly, the weaponization of the DOJ, he's called this a witch hunt. I would think that he wouldn't be repeating this so often if it wasn't resonating with his base, right? There is a chunk of the American population that does believe these things to be true, that thinks the Justice Department is being weaponized against Donald Trump. Whether it was seizing assets in the civil case, if Letitia James were actually to pursue that course of action, whether it is him actually being convicted of a felony and potentially being sentenced with something as a result, does that reinforce the argument, or does it make it more real that perhaps this was always real, if that makes sense?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack. I would say Donald Trump takes a lot from one of his mentors in life, Roy Cohn, a notorious New York attorney who oversaw a lot of really bad things in the American justice system. And one of the things that he taught Trump is just constantly be on the attack. Doesn't matter whether you tell the truth. What it matters is if you say it enough, people will believe it. And we see that in spades with Donald Trump, whether it's in the courtroom or on the campaign trail. He doesn't really care what's accurate. He's not looking for precision. He's looking for advocacy. And if his advocacy means that he's going to lie, then he's going to lie all day long, because advocacy is what matters to him. So when he goes after the judge and people say, my God, he's going to get sanctioned, he doesn't care. Sanctions, bring it on. That's just another example of lawfare. If he goes after the defendants in cases and they actually increase the amount of fines that he gets in the process, he doesn't care, because he's proving a sane man wouldn't do this if it weren't the truth, right? And he'll walk himself right off the cliff trying to convince people that his version of the truth is the truth. And by the way, in about half our country, they're buying the Donald Trump truth. And so you can't argue with his success right now. Does that get him all the way through the election and elected president? If so, we have a long road ahead of us if he's president of the United States, and this is his unleashed tactic, is making up whatever he believes the truth is.
Well, it brings us to the quandary of covering Trump, just like we learned in 20 and in 16 and again now. It certainly came to a head on Sunday morning on NBC's Meet the Press after the news network hired the former chair of the RNC, Ronna McDaniel, to be a political analyst. Hired her after she was already booked to do an interview on the show. The former host of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd, showed up to question his boss's decision, saying McDaniels has credibility issues, and spoke about it on camera. Here he is.
Look, let me deal with the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
I think our bosses owe you an apology for putting you in this situation, because I don't know what to believe. She is now a paid contributor by NBC News. I have no idea whether any answer she gave to you was because she didn't want to mess up her contract. She wants us to believe that she was speaking for the RNC when the RNC was paying for her. So she has credibility issues that she still has to deal with.
Jeannie, there's a lot here that's specific to NBC News, but I guess it brings us down to a pretty simple question. Can election deniers be reformed?
Yeah, I mean, you can hear just, it was an amazing moment to listen to Chuck Todd. We heard it from other NBC, MSNBC network stars, Mika Brzezinski, Joe Scarborough this morning. They weren't consulted, but if they had been, they would not have advised hiring her for the very reason you're talking about, Joe, which is that she has denied the election, and very recently. I also think this reflects the fact that people in the media, particularly in NBC, where she was very tough at times, they felt like this is, 6, 7 years they have been dealing with her. She hasn't been forthright. Many of them feel like she was gaslighting them. To now be working with her in this capacity, I think, is a challenge for them. But this election denial is an enormous issue, and I think this is the start of what we're going to hear going forward, because so many people formerly mainstream have joined Donald Trump. And I would just point to the fact that Marco Rubio was on ABC at the same time talking about the fact he would think about being a vice president if asked. That is a pretty stunning thing for somebody who has said really tough things about Donald Trump in the past to be supporting and joining him now with, by the way, some of the lies that Donald Trump stood in the courtroom today and said. So we're going to hear more of this as these people move away from Donald Trump and out of his orbit and try to join the mainstream, if you will, how they are going to be welcomed by people in that arena. It's going to be really tough.
Fascinating stuff here. Of course, Donald Trump used to refer to him as Lil Marco during the campaign. Marco Rubio used to call him a con man. Maybe they'll end up running together. Coming up, House Speaker Mike Johnson names a successor to chair the Select Committee on China following the resignation from Wisconsin Congressman Mike Gallagher. We'll be back with our political panel to deal with the business of Congress next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I've sort of operated under the ask forgiveness, not permission rule over the last year. And the good news is, since the speakers of the House keep changing, there's really nobody to do oversight of me.
Wisconsin Republican Congressman Mike Gallagher, who will be stepping down from Congress next month, speaking at a panel there at Harvard's Kennedy School. Back with us now, our political panel, Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University, to help us walk through everything that might shake out here from one end of Pennsylvania Avenue to another. Rick, I'll start with you on what is a dwindling majority in the House. Mr. Gallagher is not the only one leaving. We actually spoke on Friday about a lot of names that are leaving here. And when you consider looming special elections, Mike Johnson could be dealing with a majority of one at some point soon. How do you get anything done, considering the troubles that they've already had?
Yeah, I think that's a guarantee he's going to have a majority of one, because one of the things Gallagher's doing, which is really incredibly nasty, is that he's leaving on April 19th, which is after the term that you would have to be able to do a special election and replace him. So there'll be a vacancy for the balance of the year in his term. And I think that reflects the negativity within the Republican caucus. They really hate each other. Yeah. I mean, there's no love there at all. No one's trying to make it easier for Johnson, right? I mean, it's either, trying to kick him out of his job or trying to make sure he doesn't have the votes to get anything done. I mean, and this is a gang tackle. It's not just a few people who are unhappy. It's a bunch of people who are unhappy.
Well, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman from Georgia, says Johnson should expel Gallagher for the very reason you're pointing out, Rick, about the special election timeline. But Marjorie Taylor Greene also maybe wants to expel Johnson, at least from the speaker's gavel. Jeannie, does the knowledge of a one-vote margin, the not out of the realm of possibility that a Democratic speaker could end up elected in that vote breakdown, prevent that from happening?
Yeah, just listening to you, Kayleigh, I'm thinking, who doesn't she want to expel or get rid of? Marjorie Taylor Greene is on a tear here. I was listening to somebody who said we could end up potentially with a Democratic speaker. I doubt it. But the reality is we do not have a GOP majority in the House, and we haven't since Kevin McCarthy made this agreement to get the speaker job. I mean, it has been only a a Republicans working with Democrats under suspensions of the rules majority that have been able to at all come together and pass anything, including the budget 6 months late that passed on Friday. So, it's not a Republican majority to speak of at all, and it hasn't been for some time.
Well, they get 2 weeks of recess to maybe take a breather and try to come back and be the majority that they can.
Sure.
Rick Davis and Jeannie Shansano, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. And, of course, for more coverage on the majority, the minority, everything that happens here in Washington, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online.
And remember, it's not recess, it's the home district work period.
You're right.
Back with more work tomorrow here on Balance of Power. We'll see you then on Bloomberg TV and radio.